The morning mist clung to Charleston Harbor like a shroud of foreboding on April 11th, 1861, as Major Robert Anderson peered through his field glasses at the hostile batteries surrounding Fort Sumter. The fortress that had once symbolized federal authority now stood as an isolated island of Union defiance in the heart of Confederate South Carolina. Anderson could count no fewer than 43 guns trained on his position from the shore batteries at Fort Moultrie, Cummings Point, and the floating battery anchored nearby. "Sir, the men are asking about supplies again," reported Captain Abner Doubleday, his weathered face etched with concern. The garrison of fewer than 90 men had been subsisting on salt pork and hardtack for weeks, their provisions dwindling with each passing day. Anderson nodded grimly, knowing that their situation grew more desperate by the hour. The political machinations that had led to this moment stretched back months. When South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th, 1860, Major Anderson had made the fateful decision to abandon the indefensible Fort Moultrie and concentrate his small force at the more formidable Fort Sumter. This move had been interpreted as an act of aggression by the newly formed Confederate government, though Anderson insisted it was merely a defensive precaution. President Abraham Lincoln faced an impossible dilemma. To resupply the fort would likely provoke war, yet to abandon it would signal federal weakness and potentially encourage other border states to join the Confederacy. The pressure from his cabinet was immense, with some advisors urging immediate military action, while others counseled restraint. As referenced in contemporary accounts from the Charleston Mercury newspaper, the local population watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The city's residents had grown accustomed to the sight of Confederate soldiers drilling in the streets and the constant bustle of military preparations. Children played war games in Marion Square, mimicking the soldiers they observed, unaware that real conflict loomed on the horizon. General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard, the Confederate commander responsible for Charleston's defenses, had been Anderson's student at West Point years earlier. Now the bonds of shared military education and mutual respect would be tested by the harsh realities of political division. Beauregard had spent weeks positioning his artillery and training his gunners, knowing that when the moment came, precision would be paramount. The Confederate batteries consisted of an impressive array of weaponry: 32-pounder cannons at Fort Moultrie, massive columbiads at Cummings Point, and mortar batteries on James Island. Each position had been carefully surveyed and ranged, with Fort Sumter serving as the central target. The Palmetto Guard, the Charleston Light Dragoons, and other local militia units had swelled the Confederate ranks, their enthusiasm compensating for their lack of professional military experience. Inside Fort Sumter, the Union garrison maintained their daily routines with disciplined determination. Reveille sounded at dawn, followed by inspection, drill, and maintenance duties. The fort's thick masonry walls, designed to withstand naval bombardment, provided some comfort, though Anderson worried about the vulnerability of the barracks and the magazine. The fort's own artillery consisted of 60 guns, but many were positioned to defend against naval attack rather than shore bombardment. As April 12th dawned clear and calm, both sides sensed that the long period of tense waiting was drawing to a close. The stage was set for the opening act of America's bloodiest conflict. The telegraph lines hummed with urgent messages on April 11th, 1861, as the final diplomatic chess moves played out between Washington and Charleston. Colonels James Chestnut, Jr., Captain Stephen Dill Lee, and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Robert Chisholm had arrived at Fort Sumter under a flag of truce, carrying General Beauregard's ultimatum to Major Anderson. The small boat cut through the choppy waters of Charleston Harbor, its white flag snapping in the harbor breeze. Anderson received the Confederate delegation in his Spartan quarters, the walls bare, except for a portrait of George Washington and a map of Charleston Harbor marked with defensive positions. The message they carried was brief but momentous: surrender the fort or face bombardment. Anderson read the document slowly, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Years of military service had prepared him for difficult decisions, but none quite like this. He was a Southerner by birth, born in Kentucky, yet sworn to uphold his oath to the federal government. The weight of history pressed upon his shoulders as he contemplated his response. "Gentlemen," Anderson finally spoke, his voice carrying the measured tone of professional military discourse. "I must respectfully decline your demand. However, I will add that if you do not batter the fort to pieces about us, we shall be starved out in a few days." This conditional statement revealed both his determination to resist and the practical reality of his situation. The Confederate delegates exchanged glances, recognizing the subtle opening Anderson had provided. They returned to General Beauregard, with Anderson's formal refusal, but also with the information that starvation might accomplish what bombardment would achieve more violently. Beauregard immediately telegraphed the Confederate Secretary of War, Leroy Pope Walker, seeking guidance on whether to wait for hunger to force surrender or proceed with immediate attack. Walker's response crackled across the telegraph wires from Montgomery, Alabama. "Do not desire needlessly to bombard Fort Sumter. If Major Anderson will state the time at which, as indicated by him, he will evacuate, and agree that in the meantime he will not use his guns against us unless ours should be employed against Fort Sumter, you are authorized thus to avoid the effusion of blood." This message prompted Beauregard to send his aides back to Fort Sumter for a second negotiation. At 1:20 in the morning of April 12th, Chestnut, Lee, and Chisholm again approached the fortress under their flag of truce. The harbor was eerily quiet, broken only by the lapping of waves against the fort's foundation and the distant sound of preparations at the Confederate batteries. Anderson consulted with his officers in a hastily convened council of war. Captain Doubleday, Lieutenant Norman Jonathan Hall, and the fort's surgeon, Dr. Samuel Wiley Crawford, gathered around a flickering candle as they debated their options. The democratic nature of this discussion reflected Anderson's leadership style and the unique circumstances they faced. After considerable deliberation, Anderson provided his final answer. He would evacuate the fort by noon on April 15th, provided he received no contradictory orders from Washington and was not attacked in the interim. However, he added a crucial caveat. He would not agree to refrain from returning fire if attacked. The Confederate delegation huddled in the fort's guardroom, reviewing Anderson's conditional surrender offer. Colonel Chestnut, acting under Beauregard's instructions, determined that Anderson's conditions were unacceptable. At 3:15 in the morning, he handed Anderson a formal notice that bombardment would commence in 1 hour. As the Confederate boat disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, Anderson gathered his men in the fort's parade ground. The garrison stood in formation, their faces grave in the lamplight as their commander explained the situation. "Men," Anderson announced, "we are about to be bombarded, and we must defend this fort to the best of our ability." The soldiers dispersed to their battle stations with quiet efficiency, checking their weapons and preparing for what they knew would be a historic engagement. In the distance, the lights of Charleston twinkled peacefully, unaware that within the hour, the sound of cannon fire would announce the beginning of America's Civil War. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, the harbor stillness shattered as Captain George Sheds James of the Palmetto Guard pulled the lanyard of a 10-inch mortar at Fort Johnson. The shell arced high over Charleston Harbor, its fuse tracing a glowing path through the pre-dawn darkness, before exploding above Fort Sumter in a brilliant burst of fire and smoke. The American Civil War had begun. The symbolic first shot had been offered to Edmund Ruffin, the white-haired Virginia secessionist who had become a living embodiment of Southern resistance to federal authority. Ruffin, then 67 years old, had traveled to Charleston specifically to witness this moment, and the honor of firing the opening round perfectly suited his passionate advocacy for Southern independence. However, some accounts suggest that the actual first shot came from Captain James at Fort Johnson, with Ruffin firing one of the early rounds from the iron battery on Cummings Point. The thunder of that initial explosion rolled across Charleston, harbor like a proclamation, awakening the city's residents who rushed to their rooftops and balconies to witness the historic bombardment. Church bells began tolling throughout Charleston, and crowds gathered along the waterfront, many treating the spectacle as a grand entertainment, rather than the opening of a devastating national conflict. Within moments of the first shot, the Confederate batteries erupted in coordinated fury. Fort Moultrie, positioned across the channel from Sumter, opened with its powerful guns under the command of Colonel William Ransom Calhoun. The floating battery, an innovative iron-plated vessel designed specifically for this engagement, added its firepower to the bombardment. From Cummings Point, the iron battery and other positions joined the thunderous chorus. Inside Fort Sumter, Major Anderson's men had taken their positions at the first alarm. The massive walls shuddered with each impact, and mortar shells burst overhead, raining fragments into the parade ground. Anderson, demonstrating the cool professionalism that had earned him his reputation, waited nearly 2 hours before ordering return fire. This delay was partly tactical. He wanted to conserve ammunition and observe the enemy's positions, and partly symbolic, ensuring that history would record the Confederates as the aggressors. Captain Abner Doubleday, who would later be incorrectly credited with inventing baseball, had the honor of firing Fort Sumter's first shot in response. At 7 o'clock, he aimed one of the fort's 42-pounder cannons at the iron battery on Cummings Point and pulled the lanyard. The massive gun roared, sending its projectile toward the Confederate position with deadly intent. The Union garrison quickly settled into the rhythm of battle. Lieutenant Jefferson Columbus Davis, whose name would later cause confusion due to its similarity to the Confederate presidents, commanded a section of guns on the fort's upper tier. His men worked with mechanical precision, loading, aiming, and firing despite the constant shower of Confederate shells. The acrid smoke of gunpowder soon filled the air, making breathing difficult and visibility poor. As morning progressed into afternoon, the intensity of the bombardment remained constant. The Confederate gunners had achieved remarkable accuracy, with shells striking the fort's walls and buildings with devastating regularity. The officers' quarters caught fire multiple times, requiring dangerous firefighting efforts by the garrison. The flagstaff was shot away, but Sergeant Peter Hart and others risked their lives to nail the colors to a makeshift pole, ensuring the stars and stripes continued to fly defiantly over the battered fortress. The psychological impact of the bombardment on both sides was profound. For the Confederates, each successful hit represented vindication of their cause and proof of their military prowess. Their gunners, many of them volunteers from Charleston's finest families, worked their pieces with enthusiasm and growing confidence. The Citadel Cadets, South Carolina's military academy students, participated in the bombardment, their youthful excitement adding to the carnival atmosphere that prevailed in the Confederate camps. For Anderson's men, the constant thunder of incoming shells created a unique form of stress. They were trapped in their fortress, unable to retreat, forced to endure hour after hour of bombardment while knowing that a single lucky shot to the magazine could end their resistance instantly. Yet morale remained surprisingly high, sustained by their professional pride and confidence in their commander's leadership. By evening of the first day, both sides had settled into a deadly routine that would continue through the night and into the following day. The second day of bombardment dawned gray and smoky over Charleston Harbor on April 13, 1861. Throughout the night, Confederate mortar fire had continued sporadically, denying the Union garrison any meaningful rest. Major Anderson surveyed his battered command as the morning light revealed the extent of the damage inflicted during the siege. Previous day's intense shelling. The fort's interior presented a scene of controlled chaos. Chunks of masonry lay scattered across the parade ground where Confederate shells had chipped away at the thick walls. The barracks building showed multiple holes and several of the gun embrasures had been damaged by direct hits. Most critically, the fort's supply of cartridge bags was running dangerously low, forcing the defenders to improvise with cloth torn from bed sheets and clothing. Anderson's tactical situation grew more desperate with each passing hour. His original plan to concentrate fire on Fort Moultrie had proven ineffective due to the limited elevation of his guns, which were primarily designed to engage ships rather than elevated shore positions. The Confederate batteries, positioned at various points around the harbor, could maintain their bombardment with impunity, while the Union forces struggled to respond effectively. Dr. Samuel Wiley Crawford, the fort's surgeon, had established a makeshift hospital in one of the casemates, though remarkably, no serious casualties had yet occurred. The thick masonry walls provided excellent protection for the defenders, and the Confederate gunners, despite their enthusiasm, lacked the precision necessary to achieve decisive results. Crawford moved among the men, treating minor injuries, from shell fragments and stone chips, while maintaining detailed notes that would later provide valuable historical insights into the siege. The most serious threat to Fort Sumter came not from enemy fire, but from the fires that repeatedly broke out in the wooden buildings within the fort. Confederate hotshot, cannonballs heated red-hot in furnaces before firing, proved particularly effective at starting blazes. The garrison's efforts to combat these fires required constant vigilance and exposed men to enemy fire as they fought the flames with bucket brigades and wet blankets. As documented in contemporary reports from the Charleston Courier newspaper, the city's residents continued to treat the bombardment as public entertainment. Fashionably dressed ladies and gentlemen gathered on rooftops and balconies, some bringing picnic lunches to enjoy while watching the spectacle. The Mills House Hotel, one of Charleston's finest establishments, offered special viewing parties for guests, complete with refreshments and opera glasses for better observation of the action. Lieutenant Norman Jonathan Hall commanded one of the fort's gun crews and maintained a detailed log of the engagement. His records indicate that by the afternoon of April 13th, Fort Sumter had fired approximately 1,000 rounds, while receiving an estimated 4,000 Confederate shells and shot. The disparity reflected both the Union's ammunition shortage and the tactical disadvantage of their position. The Confederate forces maintained their bombardment with methodical persistence. General Beauregard had positioned observers throughout Charleston to monitor the effectiveness of his guns and adjust fire accordingly. The young general, impeccably dressed and displaying the courtly manners that characterize the antebellum South's military elite, moved between his various battery positions, encouraging his gunners and fine-tuning their tactics. Captain Stephen Dill Lee, who had participated in the pre-bombardment negotiations, commanded the iron battery on Cummings Point. His innovative, iron-plated position had proven remarkably effective, absorbing numerous direct hits from Fort Sumter, while maintaining its ability to return fire. Lee's success at Cummings Point would later contribute to his rapid promotion and significant role in the Confederate war effort. Inside Fort Sumter, the strain of continuous bombardment began to tell on the defenders. Sleep became impossible, except in brief snatches between the most intense periods of shelling. The men's uniforms grew filthy with masonry dust and gunpowder residue, and their faces showed the hollow-eyed exhaustion of soldiers under extreme stress. Yet discipline remained intact, and Anderson's leadership continued to inspire confidence among his subordinates. As the second day wore on, Anderson faced the increasingly difficult decision of whether to continue resistance or seek terms for surrender. His men were exhausted, ammunition was nearly depleted, and the fort's defensive capabilities had been significantly degraded. The symbolic importance of Fort Sumter had already been established. The Confederacy had fired the first shots of the war, but Anderson wondered whether continued resistance served any useful purpose. The answer to that question would come with the dawn of April 14th, as the final act of the Fort Sumter drama prepared to unfold. April 14th, 1861, dawned with an ominous red glow over Charleston Harbor, as fires continued to smolder within Fort Sumter's battered walls. Major Anderson stood atop the fort's ramparts, his uniform torn and smoke-stained, surveying the scene of destruction that surrounded him. The once proud fortress now resembled a wounded giant, its walls pockmarked with shell holes, and its interior, buildings reduced to smoking ruins. The situation had become critical during the night. A Confederate hotshot had ignited the fort's main magazine area, forcing Anderson's men to flood the powder storage with water to prevent a catastrophic explosion. This desperate measure had saved their lives but eliminated any possibility of sustained resistance. With most of their ammunition now useless and the fort's defensive capabilities severely compromised, Anderson faced the inevitable reality of surrender. Captain Abner Doubleday gathered the remaining serviceable ammunition and conducted a careful inventory. The results confirmed Anderson's worst fears. Fewer than 6 rounds remained for each of the fort's operational guns. The cartridge situation was even more desperate, with only a handful of proper charges available for the remaining powder. Any continued resistance would be purely symbolic, serving no military purpose while potentially costing lives unnecessarily. The Confederate bombardment had continued throughout the night, though with somewhat less intensity than the previous days. General Beauregard's gunners maintained their positions, ready to resume full-scale bombardment at dawn, but the Confederate commander had begun to recognize that Fort Sumter's resistance was nearing its end. Observers with telescopes reported that the Union flag still flew over the fortress, though the flagstaff had been shot away multiple times and replaced with improvised poles. Inside the fort, Sergeant Peter Hart had become something of a legend among the garrison for his repeated efforts to keep the stars and stripes flying. Each time Confederate fire brought down the flag, Hart would risk enemy fire to recover the colors and raise them again on whatever pole or staff could be improvised. His determination symbolized the garrison's refusal to surrender despite their desperate circumstances. The psychological toll of the bombardment had become evident among both the defenders and their Confederate opponents. Within Fort Sumter, the constant thunder of incoming shells had created a unique form of combat stress. Men flinched involuntarily at unexpected sounds, and several showed signs of what would later be recognized as shell shock. Yet discipline remained intact, a testament to Anderson's leadership and the professionalism of the regular Army garrison. Dr. Crawford continued his medical duties while also serving as an informal historian of the siege. His detailed observations would later provide valuable insights into both the military and human aspects of the engagement. Crawford noted that despite the intense bombardment, only one man had suffered a serious injury, a soldier struck by masonry fragments who remained at his post despite his wounds. The Confederate forces had also begun to show signs of fatigue after nearly 48 hours of continuous bombardment. Gun crews worked in shifts to maintain the barrage, but even the most enthusiastic volunteers found the routine of loading, aiming, and firing increasingly monotonous. General Beauregard recognized that his forces needed to achieve decisive results soon, or risk losing the momentum that had characterized the early stages of the bombardment. As morning progressed, Anderson made his final preparations for what he knew would be the fort's last day of resistance. He assembled his officers for what amounted to a council of war, though the options available were severely limited. Captain Doubleday, Lieutenant Hall, and the other company commanders listened as their commanding officer outlined their situation. With characteristic honesty and precision. "Gentlemen," Anderson announced, "we have fought with honor and maintained our duty to the federal government. However, our position has become untenable. We cannot continue effective resistance without ammunition, and further fighting would serve no useful military purpose." The officers nodded their agreement, recognizing the wisdom of their commander's assessment. The decision to seek terms for surrender had been difficult but inevitable. Anderson drafted a message to General Beauregard, offering to evacuate Fort Sumter in exchange for the honors of war, the right to march out with colors flying, drums beating, and personal weapons. This traditional military courtesy would allow the garrison to maintain their dignity while acknowledging the reality of their situation. As the white flag was raised over Fort Sumter, both sides prepared for the final act of this opening drama of the Civil War. The white flag of truce snapped briskly in the harbor breeze at noon on April 14, 1861, signaling the end of Fort Sumter's resistance. Major Anderson had made the difficult decision to seek terms for surrender, recognizing that further fighting would accomplish nothing while potentially costing lives unnecessarily. The 34-hour bombardment had finally achieved its objective, though not through the devastating destruction many had anticipated. General Beauregard received Anderson's surrender offer with the courtesy befitting two professional soldiers who had once shared the bonds of military education. The Confederate commander's response demonstrated the chivalrous conduct that characterized many early Civil War engagements, before the conflict's increasing brutality eliminated such niceties. Beauregard granted Anderson's request for the honors of war, allowing the Union garrison to march out with colors flying and drums beating. The surrender negotiations were conducted with remarkable civility, considering the historic significance of the moment. Colonel James Chestnut, Jr., Captain Stephen Dill Lee, and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Robert Chisholm returned to Fort Sumter under their flag of truce, but this time as victors rather than negotiators. They found Anderson and his officers maintaining military bearing despite their obvious exhaustion and the destruction surrounding them. Inside the battered fortress, the Union garrison prepared for their departure with quiet dignity. The men cleaned their weapons, straightened their uniforms as best they could, and prepared their personal belongings for evacuation. Despite the circumstances of their surrender, morale remained surprisingly high. They had conducted themselves with honor under impossible conditions, and their resistance had demonstrated Union determination to maintain federal authority. The terms of surrender reflected the mutual respect between Anderson and Beauregard. The Union garrison would be allowed to fire a 50-gun salute to their flag before lowering it for the final time. They would march out of the fort with their personal weapons, knapsacks, and all company property they could carry. Transportation would be provided to take them north to a Union port, where they would be free to rejoin federal forces. As the afternoon wore on, both sides made their final preparations for the formal surrender ceremony scheduled for the following morning. The Confederate batteries ceased their bombardment, allowing an eerie quiet to settle over Charleston Harbor for the first time in 3 days. The silence seemed almost oppressive after the constant thunder of artillery that had dominated the previous 34 hours. Dr. Samuel Wiley Crawford used the respite to conduct a final medical examination of the garrison. Remarkably, considering the intensity of the bombardment, no one had been killed during the engagement. Several men showed minor injuries from shell fragments and flying masonry, but all remained fit for duty. This extraordinary record spoke both to the protection afforded by the fort's thick walls and to the limitations of mid-19th century artillery accuracy. Captain Abner Doubleday organized the company for their final night in Fort Sumter, establishing guard details and ensuring that military routine continued, despite their circumstances. The captain's methodical approach helped maintain discipline and provided the men with familiar structure during an emotionally difficult period. Many of the soldiers had served at Fort Sumter for months, developing strong attachments to both the fortress and their mission. The people of Charleston prepared for a victory celebration that would mark the Confederacy's first military success. Church bells pealed throughout the city, and impromptu parades formed in the streets as news of the surrender spread. The Charleston Light Dragoons, the Palmetto Guard, and other local militia units basked in their triumph, though few understood that this bloodless victory would be followed by 4 years of unprecedented carnage. General Beauregard issued orders for the formal surrender ceremony, emphasizing the importance of treating the Union garrison with appropriate military courtesy. The Confederate commander understood that the manner of Fort Sumter's surrender would set important precedents for future conduct of the war. His decision to grant the honors of war demonstrated both his personal character and his hope that the conflict might be resolved without excessive bloodshed. As night fell over Charleston Harbor on April 14th, both sides reflected on the historic events of the previous 3 days. The bombardment of Fort Sumter had achieved its immediate objective, removing federal authority from South Carolina soil, while serving notice that the Confederacy was prepared to fight for its independence. For the Union, the loss of Fort Sumter represented a significant symbolic defeat, but Anderson's determined resistance had demonstrated federal resolve to maintain the constitutional system. The stage was now set for the final act of the Fort Sumter drama, as the morning of April 15th would witness the formal transfer of the fortress from federal to Confederate control. The morning of April 15th, 1861, dawned clear and crisp over Charleston Harbor, as Major Anderson's garrison prepared for their final ceremony at Fort Sumter. The smoke had cleared from the battered fortress, revealing the full extent of the damage inflicted during the 34-hour bombardment. Yet despite the destruction, the American flag still flew defiantly over the ramparts, awaiting its ceremonial lowering in the formal surrender that would complete the transfer of the fort to Confederate control. Anderson had spent the night making final preparations for the 50-gun salute that would honor the flag before its removal. This gesture, granted by General Beauregard as part of the surrender terms, represented one of the last acts of federal authority in South Carolina. The ritual would be conducted with full military honors, maintaining the dignity of both the flag and the men who had defended it against overwhelming odds. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Union garrison assembled in the fort's parade ground for the ceremony. Despite their torn and smoke-stained uniforms, the soldiers maintained perfect military bearing as they formed ranks around the flagstaff. Captain Abner Doubleday commanded the gun crews that would fire the farewell salute, while the fort's small band prepared to play appropriate martial music for the occasion. The Confederate forces maintained respectful positions at their batteries, with many officers and men gathering to witness this historic moment. General Beauregard had issued strict orders regarding the conduct of his troops during the ceremony, emphasizing that any breach of military courtesy would reflect poorly on the Confederate cause. The chivalrous nature of the surrender had captured public attention throughout the South, establishing important precedents for future conduct of the war. As the ceremony began, Anderson's voice carried clearly across the harbor as he delivered brief remarks to his assembled garrison. "Men," he announced, "we have conducted ourselves with honor during our time at this post. Today we lower our flag not in defeat, but in recognition that we have fulfilled our duty to the federal government." Under impossible circumstances, the soldiers listened in respectful silence, understanding the historic significance of the moment they were experiencing. The 50-gun salute commenced at precisely 2:15, with each cannon firing in measured sequence. The thunder of the guns echoed across Charleston Harbor, announcing to all within hearing that an era was ending. On the 5th discharge, however, tragedy struck when Private Daniel Howe was killed by a premature explosion of one of the guns. Private Edward Galloway was mortally wounded in the same accident, becoming the conflict's second casualty. The irony that the Civil War's first deaths occurred during the surrender ceremony rather than during the bombardment was not lost on observers. Despite this tragic interruption, the ceremony continued with solemn dignity. Anderson personally supervised the lowering of the stars and stripes, folding the flag with reverent care before presenting it to his adjutant for safekeeping. The symbolism of this moment resonated far beyond Charleston Harbor, as news of Fort Sumter's surrender spread throughout both North and South via telegraph lines. Captain Stephen Dill Lee led a small Confederate delegation that formally accepted the fort's surrender and took possession of the facility on behalf of the Confederate States of America. The transfer was conducted with appropriate military protocol, including the exchange of written documents acknowledging the change of command. Lee's role in both the pre-bombardment negotiations and the final surrender ceremony reflected his growing importance in the Confederate military hierarchy. The Union garrison then marched out of Fort Sumter with colors flying and drums beating, as specified in the surrender terms. The Isabel, a civilian steamer chartered by the federal government, waited at the wharf to transport Anderson and his men to New York. The sight of the disciplined soldiers maintaining perfect formation despite their defeat impressed even their Confederate opponents, who recognized the professionalism displayed by the regular Army troops. As the Isabel departed Charleston Harbor, Anderson stood at the vessel's stern, watching Fort Sumter recede into the distance. The Major's thoughts during this moment remained private, but observers noted his obvious emotion as he bid farewell to the fortress where he had conducted what many considered an impossible defense. His decision to move his garrison from the defensible Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter had precipitated the crisis, but his subsequent conduct under siege had earned widespread respect. The Confederate occupation of Fort Sumter marked a significant symbolic victory for the newly formed nation, demonstrating its ability to enforce its sovereignty within its claimed borders. However, the bloodless nature of the victory masked the enormous challenges that lay ahead for both sides. The bombardment had answered the question of whether the Confederacy would fight for its independence, but it had also guaranteed that the Union would respond with force to restore federal authority. News of Fort Sumter's surrender reached President Lincoln in Washington on the evening of April 15th, confirming his worst fears about the growing crisis. The attack on a federal installation provided the justification Lincoln needed to mobilize Union forces for what he hoped would be a brief conflict to restore constitutional government. His call for 75,000 volunteers would transform a localized confrontation into a national civil war. The Battle of Fort Sumter had ended without decisive military results. The fortress changed hands without significant casualties during the fighting, but its political consequences proved immense. The bombardment had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat, committing both North and South to a conflict that would ultimately cost over 600,000 American lives. Major Anderson's prediction that the war would be long and costly proved tragically accurate, though few at the time shared his pessimistic assessment. As evening fell over Charleston Harbor on April 15, 1861, the Confederate flag flew over Fort Sumter for the first time. The fortress that had symbolized federal authority now represented Southern independence, marking the beginning of America's bloodiest conflict. The echoes of those first shots would reverberate for 4 years, until another April day in 1865 would finally silence the guns and restore the Union that Fort Sumter's surrender had fractured.